So the whole reason any of my Ramble-Talks exist is it's almost always when I'm getting ready for work. When I'm by myself and I'm just wandering around doing things, getting ready for work, driving, my brain will just start putting weird shit together. Because I don't know why, but my brain thinks everything is related. I'll watch a video about something some therapist is saying about estranged parents, and then I'll be thinking about a terrible Thanksgiving dinner that I had, and then I'll be looking at different quotes in my book that I've written down. And my brain will be like, all these things connect together. And one of the things it'll do is it'll think about phrases and it will categorize them. And I'm sure other people must do this, surely. My brain was telling me stories about stuff I already know about myself. And then it was like, you know that phrase about when people tell you who they are, you should believe them? And I was like, yeah. And then my brain was like, well, what about that whole, if you have to tell people you're something, you're probably not that thing? Aren't those like opposite? But then I'll be like, no, but like they're both true though. So then I'll spend 30 minutes of my morning trying to like explain to myself how different things can exist at the same time. So I don't even know if anyone gets anything out of these videos. That's just what's happening. This is like literally all of these videos are just me talking to myself, and then I'll come into my office and I'll tell you about the thing I was thinking about. So today what we're thinking about is actions versus words and behaviors and how you sort of reconcile all of those things. The first phrase that came to mind was, when people tell you who they are, believe them. This, I feel like, is very true. I don't understand when we see people and they tell us, hey, I'm gonna do this thing, that we go, no, you're not. You're just joking. Okay, maybe I do understand. When I was a teenager, at peak internet, 2015, 2016, we were in full irony, satire mode. Everything was ironic. People got away with a lot of crazy shit on the internet that's just like out there, loud and proud. And we all went, no, it's ironic. And I was one of those people, I was very into the like hyper atheist skeptic community, and I loved that shit. I ate it up. All the like weird controversial artists, I was all there for it. But now that I'm older, I'm realizing like everyone I liked on the internet that I thought was being ironic was not. All the time I'll hear about some like old YouTuber that I used to like, and they'll be like, this person actually like a terrible human being, or like crazy abusive, or super racist, or super sexist. And you'll look back at all the things that they did and you'll be like, oh, they weren't joking the whole time. My whole life thinking like, oh, we're joking about it, because obviously that's not true, and someone who would think that was true for real is ignorant and dumb. And then I realized that like a lot of people joke to sort of mask the fact that they're actually being very serious. It trickles down in really interesting ways. Politicians, they will say like, hey, this is in my budget, this is what I am doing, this is stuff that I believe in, these are things that I want us to revisit the Monroe verdict, I want us to deport all these immigrants, I want us to impose tariffs. And then people will vote, and then they'll go, I didn't really think they were going to do that. It was just a threat. They were just being satirical. They were just being ironic. It was just a joke. And then they find out it wasn't a joke, and they're terribly upset. Like, I empathize with it. But it's also just, like, very unfortunate to see in, like, a funny way. It's, like, a little bit of a Schadenfreude thing. I've been there. But at the same time, at a certain point, you have to sort of internalize that when people tell you a thing, you should believe them. There's sort of like a caveat to this. Like, the phrase is very simple. It sticks in your brain. It's very nice. It sort of massages the neurons. But it's not only a pattern of repeating the same sorts of jokes over and over and over again. There's a little bit of gauging the purpose of the activity. If you think about it, like if someone is saying like horribly crazy toxic shit, why would they do that? Like, why would you do that as a joke? Because there's like, oh, this is a little bit silly because it's ignorant. But then there's like people expressing beliefs or opinions that are so outlandish that initially we're like, oh, they're just joking. It's just a joke. But there's real consequences to saying certain kinds of things on the internet. I'm not super convinced cancel culture is real all the time in every case. But if we believe cancel culture is a thing that can happen, there's sometimes real consequences, especially if you're a normal person. If you're a celebrity, you can probably bounce back. You wait a couple years, you come back. If you're a normal person and you say some crazy shit on the internet, you can lose your job, you can lose your home, you can lose your family. There's a lot of severe consequences. So when someone goes out of their way to share an opinion that is unpopular, they probably mean it. This isn't to say that you can't hold unpopular opinions or that that's bad on its own. I'm just saying that if you know someone who's very loud and vocal about an unpopular opinion consistently over time, even if they're mostly joking, like guys who try to be edgy and they'll just say the N-word all the time. Sometimes it's like, oh, I'm just trying to be silly and rebellious. I wouldn't recommend that, but I know that's a thing. But like, there's a point where it stops being like edgy and rebellious and like maybe a little bit ignorant to like, There's real consequences to this behavior, and if you are still sharing these thoughts and opinions in your outside voice, might be true. Technically, yes. When people tell you who they are, you should believe them. It's also important to look at what they're getting out of it. One of the things I've realized is that sometimes we say offensive things because they're kind of funny. In the right group, they can be kind of funny. But it's important to look at the context of who we're saying these things to. If someone looks you in the eyes and says something incredibly hurtful and mean, and you can tell that they enjoy your discomfort, like they're actually getting enjoyment out of you being hurt or sad, and that is the point of the thing they are saying, that's just being a dick. That's just being an asshole. I know people don't like to label others as sexist or racist or whatever, but I think we can all agree that when you are doing something explicitly to make one person in the group feel hurt or uncomfortable or sad or unsafe on purpose, and that is the point of the joke, you are being an asshole. That's just a general rule for life. Then I think after we identify the patterns, after we recognize that someone is being hurtful on purpose, there are some little areas where it's a little bit interesting and contradictory. One of the other things that comes up is if you have to tell people you're something, you're probably not that thing. Pretty good rule. If someone says, oh no, I'm definitely not a serial killer, when you go on a date with them, at least keep it in mind. At least consider why someone would need to tell you they're not a serial killer. They could be nervous. Sometimes it's just nerves. The same thing goes if people are being overly performative. If someone has to put in their bio and everywhere that they're such a great feminist, they're such an ally or whatever, I would be a teeny bit suspicious about that, because I feel if you are a genuinely kind, loving person, that will come through on its own. But a lot of people, they tend to overcompensate when they know deep down they're not really that thing. They know deep down they're not really that person. So they need to overcompensate. They need to hyperact like that thing. The human brain, we're pretty good at sensing something that is not authentic 100%. There's sort of a tipping point. Someone will get away for a really long time with pretending to be a certain way, and then at a certain point they'll go just a bit too far with the inauthenticity, and then all of a sudden it's a dog pile, and we're you are a terrible human being the whole time, and I knew it. I was never tricked by you. It makes me think of this really specific thing. For Christmas, I was all excited because my brother was going to come. He didn't end up being able to make it, but I'd been telling my family that I live with a lot about him and how important he was to me, and some of the experiences that we had growing up. One of the people, they did something so sweet. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know how to make a guest room. Should I give him toothpaste? So she got all these little shampoos and soaps and stuff, and she made it up all nice like she would do for her guest room, and she included makeup products for him. And the reason this is interesting is because the family I now live with, very conservative. But when I think to my own childhood and my parents, who presented themselves as very liberal Christians, very progressive, were super cool with the gays, my brother, even when he was very little, he had very sort of feminine traits or disposition. I don't know what you want to call it. He was just a sensitive kid. He was a very sweet, sensitive kid. He was very interested in sort of more theatrical things like dresses and stuff, or expressing himself. And my parents worked so hard to stamp that out of him. And it was always no, it's not because we're threatened that he might be gay. It's because we're worried he'll be bullied, So he can't be in drama class because we're worried he might be bullied for playing the girl part, even though that's what he's interested in, and we don't want his grades to suffer. Yeah, there's always a reason. I would vehemently refuse to shave my legs. I was I hate this. This is the patriarchy. I didn't actually know what the patriarchy was at the time. I just really hated the concept of having to do something simply because people told me to do it. I was this has no benefit to me. I would refuse to. But on the other hand, my brother, he was very young age. I would like to shave my legs. It would be nice for me. And my parents were immediately no, you can't. And I, being the little serious literal rules child that I was well, that's not fair. Why do I have to and he can't? What's the difference? And their only explanation was well, he'll be bullied for it because boys don't shave their legs. 2 years later, my dad started shaving his legs for triathlons, but whatever. The entire time, my parents put themselves out there as very progressive, very loving Christians. They did all the community service shit, every single year we did hampers and donations and church drives and shit. But when I watched them interact with their own children. You know, after all this, like, oh, family is the most important thing to us, I repeatedly saw them throw their children to the side whenever they weren't useful, whenever they weren't like fulfilling the role that they wanted, and like constantly trying to crush the gay out of my brother. It's really sad. I love my brother so much, and I'm actually like really mad about it, but sometimes you have to laugh about these things. So I think about like this family in a lot of the like political discussions and the way that they phrase things and the way that they talk. You would assume certain things about them, and this is where the whole actions speaking louder than words things is important. I've seen so many conversations lately of family members cutting ties with people over the election results in the US. On the one hand, I'm like, you do that. Okay, I'm not in contact with my parents anymore, and honestly, it was the best thing that's ever happened to me, even though it was very traumatic at the time. If you have a family member who's like insanely racist to you, or like terrible, or just like not a good person to have in your life, and they make every day worse, you don't need them in your life. I'm not saying you can't do that, but I have noticed there's sort of been this like steer towards not interacting with people at all if the like verbal views or morals that they hold are opposed to your own. And I don't always think that makes sense. When I was in high school, the Donald Trump like first elections was happening, and I had one friend in my school who is definitely a conservative, and he very much liked Donald Trump, and he was in the minority at the time because we were all in the like, haha, Donald Trump will never be president phase. And then when the election happened, it was like a really big deal. I remembered that like he was kind of scared to talk to me about his views, and that made me really sad because, you know, like the thoughts that he had, I could tell that like his priorities were different, I think, than what other people were prioritizing. There's someone that watches my YouTube videos that I had a similar conversation with recently where like I could tell that they were a little bit more in the Trump camp, and they were worried to tell me. I think because it's fairly obvious what my views are if we just like listen to the channel a little bit and the sorts of things I prioritize. I don't know, it makes me sad that people will look at the things that I say and the things that I care about, and they will assume that I wouldn't give them the benefit of the doubt because of their like proclaimed political views or morals. And I think that's silly. I have questions all the time about my own views, about whether they're correct or not. You know, sometimes I have to sit with myself and be like, well, what if you're crazy? You know, what if you're wrong? What if you've been brainwashed by the media? And I have to have a little serious conversation with myself about it. There is a line where the things that you say and think and share as your morals can be different. Lots of people will say, oh, I super believe in this value. I super believe in family. I super believe in God or the Bible or whatever. And then in practice, they will not do any of those things. I'm not even a Christian anymore, but I've read the Bible, and half of what Jesus talks about is being kind to the poor and the needy. A lot of the struggle of the Israelites is about them not having a home and needing to go and kill their way into having. It's a very violent book, but like there's a lot of things that I absorbed from the Bible, and there's very little that I internalized as rules, like that we should never ever brag about doing good things. It's a little bit complicated, especially with social media, because there can be some good, you know, like if there is a charity or something you're super excited about and you want to share about what they do and you think that's super cool, or like a cool drive that you did, I think that could be inspirational. I think people could look at that and go like, hey, maybe I could do a food drive, or maybe I could donate some stuff, or maybe there's something similar in my community, and that's great. So I'm not saying you can never talk about anything cool or good that you do, but it's in the way that you do it, I think, and that's where it gets a little bit tricky. You have to think about why people do a thing. Is it because they like genuinely are excited about this thing? They think it's cool. They want to share it with you. Is it because they want to be seen doing a cool, nice, good thing? It tells you a lot about that person, because there's the surface level, what you say, which can be very informative depending on what people are telling you. There's a secondary level, how well does what you say match up with what you actually do? And also the fact that occasionally people will very loudly and repeatedly say nice things about themselves that are definitely not true. You know, the amount of people I see who are like, oh, I'm an empath. I'm such a strong empath. I feel everything so terribly. And then you'll see them be just like an absolute horrible human being to other people. That's not really how that works. I'll see people that like don't understand the difference between projecting and empathy. They'll be like, you're just projecting your insecurities onto another person. And it's like, no, I'm trying to find empathy and trying to like think about what that person's situation is like so that I can be more considerate. What you do with this information is entirely up to you. Whenever I make these videos and I'm talking about like stuff I've learned or things that I use as rules for myself, it's just because these things were helpful for me. You know, I have a lot of anxiety, I have a lot of depression, I got a lot of shit going on. And sometimes certain things help for me. Certain ways of framing the world or stuff in it makes me feel better. And I share that because sometimes I'm like, maybe this will help for somebody. But an important thing of this whole equation, of the whole like recognizing that other people may say or do things that don't really align with their actions, and that what you do is important because that is what defines who you are to other people, it is recognizing that I need to be aware of who I am and what I am doing and why I am doing those things, which sometimes I overthink it a little bit. There's a balance to it. The whole point of this is not to go around and point at people and be like, you're a bad person and you're being performative. That's not the point. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to say that like these things were helpful for me to recognize in other people, but also because sometimes I need to like check myself. There are times where I'll be talking to my friends and I'll realize I'm saying some crazy ignorant shit because I've just like never thought about it before. You know, I'll realize that there's a lot of stuff that I picked up from living where I live and living with the people that I lived with and being around very abusive, shitty people that have sort of just like trickled into me over time. It's like just a couple years ago, I had no ability to apologize for anything. I hated being wrong, hated it so much. It was really hard for me. I have a lot of like self-esteem things that I'm still working on. And one of those things is that it was very hard for me to accept when things were not a certain way because I was taught that like you had to win, you know? If you were in an argument, there was a winner and there was a loser. And if you lost, you would hear about it for the rest of your life. So I got really, really good at winning arguments, which is helpful, I think, when you're with someone who is abusive to you and you're trying to like stand your ground and carve out a little space for yourself. But when you're with someone who is like loving and kind to you and treats you well, this is a terrible way to behave to another human being, okay? And this is not a gendered thing. And I say that because I have noticed that there is a tendency to believe that women cannot be abusive, and this is bullshit. Please don't cancel me, but for real, I think it's ridiculous that we can't tell that sometimes women are abusive too. Anyways, one of the very first things that sort of like clicked for me is I didn't want to be like the people that I grew up with, and part of that was learning to do the opposite action, even if it wasn't the first thing I thought about. There's this one phrase that I really like. You are not your first thought, you are your second thought in your first action. I think the first time I saw it was in the context of prejudice. You know, occasionally I think people internalize biases about certain minority groups or just certain kinds of people in general, just from the way that you're exposed to the idea, how people talk about it around you, and you may not really realize it until you're in the moment. And it's important not to beat yourself up about that. And I think this is where this conversation goes wrong all the time, is when people talk about like privilege. It sounds very mean and accusatory. It's like, you are privileged and you have better things than me, and you should feel really bad about it. I don't think that's the point. I wish there was a different word for it. I think the concept I'm trying to explain is sometimes we just have certain things that we've learned over time that we don't have control over. It's just something that's happened around us, and it could be from fear or misunderstanding or people explaining things to you in a weird way for a really long time that sort of like burrows in there. But the important thing is what you do when you are aware that that exists, right? Because I think like when you're not aware that you're ignorant of something, there's not anything you can do about it unless you self-reflect and are like, oh, maybe that's bad. Maybe I don't actually know a thing about this and I should like think about that a little bit more. And this happens to me all the time. Or I'll be like, oh, maybe I should consider that a little more carefully next time. Once you know, oh, maybe this is a weak spot for me. Maybe I don't quite know enough in this area. I don't feel super confident. Then you can choose what to do with that information. Weirdly, I was like internally always kind of a very shitty person because I grew up with very judgmental people. We'd go to a family event and we'd be having a grand old time, and my parents would be like super bubbly and happy, and they'd be super kind to everyone. And then we get in the car and they'd immediately start shit talking people, and they'd be like, oh, did you see your cousin is fat and she's like 11? They'd be talking about like how so and so has a drinking problem. Oh, it was so embarrassing that such and such a person did that thing. Like everybody, it didn't matter who it was. It could be like a random neighbor they met for 30 seconds. They'd have something terrible to say about them as soon as they were out of earshot. And your brain learns to do that if you're around people who like feed off of drama and gossip, where your brain just starts like judging people. You'll be like, that person's a slob, that person's messy, that person's bad. It's like Abed with the robot thing. And I realized that like internally there's a lot of negative shit going on about how I interacted with other people. And this is where it's interesting that like phrases have helped me a lot in my life. I can't remember where it was, but I saw this concept about this idea that like in Buddhism, your bad actions hang on your soul and carry on into your next incarnation. I don't I don't really know if incarnation is a thing. I'm honestly not convinced. But the idea that you should avoid saying or doing things that like make you feel gross, and I think that's probably an important distinction, is if there's like a part of you that feels like bad or icky about something you're thinking or doing, it might not be good for you, and you might not want to do it. There is a lot of things internally. My internal monologue is very negative, very critical, very mean, and I started just trying to act and say kind things and to be nice. And it was really hard when I got a little bit older and I was in relationships and I realized I was being like really shitty to my partners. I was like, okay, we're gonna do the opposite of being abusive. Whenever I realized that like I was being a shitty person, I was like, hey, you have to give a real apology, because I remember growing up that it was really hurtful and upsetting when people couldn't admit they were wrong. Like, it's weird that people can say or do terrible things to you, and sometimes the thing that ends up hurting the most is that they can't recognize that they did it, or they're unwilling to admit that they've done something that hurts you. It's all about them and their feelings. I had to stop myself and be like, okay, when you know you have done something wrong, you must apologize properly. That means you go to the person, you say, hey, I am sorry that I did this thing to you because. And I think the because part is important, because I had definitely experienced a lot of like, well, I'm sorry you feel that way up until that point. So it's like, you need to be better. You need to say, I am sorry that I did this thing. It was wrong because. And then you need to institute some kind of a remedy, a plan, a solution. I think next time maybe we need a signal so that I can go away, so that I can be frustrated elsewhere. I want you to know that I am not actually upset at you. I recognized after the fact that I was actually upset about something else that happened at work. It didn't have to do with you. I took it out on you, and that was wrong. And it's really hard. It's very hard to go up to someone and say, hey, I'm sorry, I was being shitty. I was wrong. Because nobody wants to feel vulnerable or shame or any of those negative emotions about yourself. It feels icky, especially if you've had to fight for such a long time against people who are trying to create a narrative around you of being a bad person. So there's a lot of like very complicated things with that. You are only responsible for you. When you go out into the world and you notice people being like weird and overly performative, you can say like, oh, I will be careful of that person, or oh, I will maybe keep my distance from that person. If you see someone who is maybe a little bit problematic, but you recognize that like their actions, their behaviors are kind and supportive and helpful, you can say like, oh, okay, maybe there are some boundaries I can put up with this person, but they are a good person to have in my life because I know they will be there for me. And I think that's the important thing when you're talking about other people. You need people in your life who you know when the chips are down, like a zombie apocalypse, these people would be there for you, right? You need that kind of a relationship. What they say or think politically is not necessarily the most important thing. If this is the kind of person that uses what they say and think to hurt other people, probably not a good person to be around. But you can't control what they do. They're over there doing whatever they're doing. You can choose how much contact you want with that person. That's all you get. But for yourself, you can work on being better. And that's hard. Like I still have a lot of trouble. I'm not saying that like I've solved it. There's a lot of things I'm still working on internally. I still haven't figured out this whole like self-love bullshit. It's very hard for me. But I know that it's important, right? I know that it is important to be kind to people. I know that it's important that when you see that you've said something that hurts people, you don't do that within reason. There are people that like they are always the victim and they will always feel hurt about everything because everything is suddenly about them. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean like for sure you did something bad. You need to own up to that. And I think the important thing is that like over time, I don't know if it works for everyone, but for me, like I stopped doing a lot of the negative behaviors that I had picked up from my family because it felt bad. I didn't like having to go to someone and admit that I had done something bad and wrong. So I was like, oh, if I just control my temper a little bit better, if I work on these skills, I won't have to anymore. And because I was also self-reflecting and being like, well, why am I being shitty to this person who is always kind and loving and always supports me and is always there for me? I was able to recognize more often what I was actually upset about, because before it was very like I existed in a storm of anger. It was like my whole brain was very cloudy, and it was very like everything makes me angry and I hate everything and everyone and the world is terrible. I hate myself. But after I started being able to like honestly talk to myself about like why I behaved the way I did and where that came from, I was able to do something about it. That's I think the part that people miss when it comes to the therapy or the self-reflection or the journaling. It's not just like to say that you have icky thoughts. It's not just to be like, oh, hey, here's all my icky thoughts. You take the icky thoughts and you look at where they come from and you look at like, where are my solutions? What sort of tools do I have? Am I missing things that I should have? How do other people do this? And you work on it, you get better. And then those things at least help you. Even if other people continue being shitty around you, you have tools now. You have tools to recognize like when people are maybe not the people you want to have in your life, or like to maybe have like a little bit of separation from. You have tools for yourself of like what you can do to help recognize those behaviors and change them and reframe them over time. How do I put it? It's like, and this is the last phrase that I had written down, is that integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. We hear this all the time, but it's a little bit unclear what that means. So, for example, one of the things I've noticed is that like sometimes shitty people, they will be very different one-on-one. Like in a group, they'll be super happy and jokey and super funny and kind and super sweet and all the best values you could put in a person. But then one-on-one with people, they'll be super shitty. They'll be like, oh my god, did you notice so-and-so is such a like shitty, stupid person? Or it'll be like very subtle, where like they're definitely saying bad things or gossiping, but it's in a very like, oh, isn't it just between you and me sort of situation. A lot of times as the outside person, I think either people will just accept this as like, oh, I'm in on a secret, and that's probably not good. Or they'll be like, oh, this person would probably shit talk me when I'm not here, and that's important to remember. So that's good for like judging other people and how much you want to take stock in what they say, especially if it's like someone who's like normally never mad at anyone and they never say bad things, and they're suddenly like, this person was really terrible to me and it hurt my feelings. Pay attention to that. That might be important. But if it's someone who like flip-flops a lot and they're like, and it's like one day so-and-so is the greatest person in the world, and the next day so-and-so is the worst terrible human being, and they are an evil narcissist and they hate everybody and they're evil and mean and bad, maybe take that with a grain of salt. Just slow your roll on that and consider that it's a secondhand source. But for you, like if you are the person who is like solo one-on-one with someone and you really, really want to talk shit about someone else, it could be important to question why. I'm not saying we can never gossip. Sometimes it's just kind of fun to gossip about people being terrible. But, it's important to reflect on it sometimes and go like, am I getting too into this? Am I too obsessed with making fun of the MLM people? Am I too obsessed with complaining about so-and-so? Is it maybe time for me to back off? Because I really do think over time you can practice being a better person and then become a better person. There were a lot of patterns of behavior and difficult things I did before that were quite bad and I've had to work on them, but now I don't notice them as much. I had to practice like recognizing things I liked about people, and it's sort of like an interesting exercise to do is if you go out into the world and you spend time talking to someone, maybe someone that you don't normally pay that much attention to, try to find something you like about that person. Even if they're not like always the best person to be around, try to find something that you like about that person and compliment them on it. Because one of the things I've realized is that, this is probably going to sound a little manipulative, when you notice people doing something that's good and you like it and it's nice, you should compliment them because they will feel good and they'll be like, oh, this is a good thing, I should do this. And it can be anything. Maybe someone's really good at juggling and you're like, hey, that's awesome that you're great at juggling. Super cool that you are super into this thing. You obviously spend a lot of time learning about this thing and you're very excited about that, and it's very interesting to hear. And you don't necessarily have to like constantly be like mean to people when they're doing something you don't like or you think is kind of shitty. You can just redirect. You can be like, hey, what about that thing you were talking to me about your book or whatever, if they're saying crazy shit. You can emphasize what sorts of behaviors you enjoy and you think are positive without having to like obsess over the negative ones. Sometimes I get stuck on that. Like sometimes we'll be hanging out with family or whatever and we're like, oh, so-and-so said a super crazy thing to me and I'm really upset about it. And my brain will get stuck on it because it really needs to like work it out in its brain. And sometimes I'll talk to someone about that and I'll be like, this is really frustrating to me and I feel like I'm crazy and I feel like that thing was wrong. And sometimes you need to do that, right? It's not like a all or nothing sort of situation. I would never say like, oh, you 100% have to do this all the time. Because I don't. I would be lying. If you feel like, oh man, I'm really critical and mean about people all the time and everyone irritates me, look at people. Be like, hey, what's a thing I like about this person? And this is there's so many tangents in this fucking video. I read this really interesting article. It's about this guy who was trying to find ways to give as many people as possible meaningful compliments. And it's always really stuck with me. And it's actually where I had the idea for the exercise. One of the things that I think the article was talking about is how like a meaningful compliment shouldn't be something that people don't have control over. Like a lot of people are like, oh, well, I can't give my coworkers compliments anymore because it'd be sexist. And that's not really what it's about. If you look at someone and you're like, wow, you have really beautiful eyes, or wow, you have like a crazy good body, it might be true. Like I see hot ladies all the time, but like those people don't have control over that. So when you compliment them on it. It doesn't necessarily feel good. It's like, well, that isn't really you seeing me. That's you seeing what I look like, and I didn't affect that. So like better compliments are generally things that people picked for themselves. You know, someone has a really interesting wallet, or they have a certain way of dressing, or a style that they picked for themselves. It's usually a pretty good one. Is like, oh, hey, I thought your bag was really cool, or your shoes are really neat, because that's something that somebody picked for themselves. You know, like they chose that as a way to express themselves. If it's like someone's really good at a skill, that can feel really nice. If you're like, hey, man, you're like crazy good at paperwork, and I really appreciate that about you. Or like, hey, I really appreciate you talking to so-and-so. I have a hard time with that, and I think it really helped. Because these are things that those people have control over. They're things that are important to them, and that can feel really good. Yeah, I don't know. If you're practicing on stuff for yourself after you learn a little bit more about like what kind of people are good to be around for you, a lot of it is reframing the internal stuff of like how you view other people and talk to other people, and what you do with the instincts and impulses you have. Because like sometimes you might have shitty knee-jerk reactions to things. You might be like, oh, I hate this person for like no conceivable reason, and there might be like crazy shit in your brain, and you have to be like, well, we know on a conscious level this is probably not a good thing, but for right now we just have to accept that's the impulse we have. But we can work on practicing that. It's hard to explain, right? Because there's performative action where it's like, I'm doing this to look good to people about a certain thing, but I definitely deep down don't believe it. You know, like when people say like, oh, I love women, I care about women so much, and then they turn out to be like absolutely awful to women. The difference, I think, between performative action and practicing action is that one of them is to cover, right? One of them is to mask bad behavior. You are being like a super ally and being like all cool with the gays because like you still want to be shitty to them, but you want to get away with it. That's performative. We don't want that. That's bad. Don't do any of that, please. But practice action is like, you may not always feel comfortable with something. You may be like a little bit anxious about it, or you know, like deep down, you probably still have some very negative views on that. You're practicing the idea of being a better person. And this, I think, will be personal. You know, like maybe there are certain things that you think are bad people things and certain things that you think are good people things. And I don't know what those are. Just as a general rule, I think like if something is hurtful, probably bad. But obviously there's mix to that. And we might not even agree on the same things. There might be things that you think are like perfectly okay that I'm like, that's bad. Or there might be things that I think are perfectly okay that you're like, shouldn't do that. And that'll be up to you to suss out. Yeah, I don't know. Just be kind. Give yourself grace. Give other people grace. Think about the kind of person you want to be. I find that has always been very helpful. Like when I was really young and I had a lot of difficulty defining myself because I was constantly having other people telling me who I was or what I should be or how I am. It was very difficult. It was very difficult to develop my own core identity and personality. And I still have a lot of doubt about that some of the time. But the one thing that I realized is that I needed a picture of who I wanted to be. What kind of a person I wanted to be, to recognize what was realistic. If you just look at people you don't like and you say, oh, I don't want to be that person, I never want to be my parents, that only gets you so far. That only gets you to like, oh, I need to do the opposite behavior of someone who's being shitty. So if someone is being a bully, I would be the opposite of a bully. It's part of it. It's part of the equation. But then you need stuff to aspire to. You need to look at the kind of person you would like to be as well, because then you can be like, well, I like that this person is a hard worker. I like that this person is easy to talk to. I like that so-and-so takes really good care of themselves, or I like that so-and-so has worked really, really hard at a skill, and I would like to be that way. Like that's another part of it, is that I think sometimes we need something aspirational, and it's important not to mix up aspirational with idolizing someone. There are people that are celebrities that I think are really cool. Dolly Parton is neat. I think it's really nice, all the charity stuff that she's done, and she's never loud about it. She just kind of does things. She seems like a very sweet, down-to-earth lady, and I like that about her. If it ever came out she was like some horrible, evil human being, I wouldn't immediately be like, I need to be exactly the same as Dolly Parton, or nothing Dolly Parton did is ever good. I would just be like, okay, so maybe don't model myself exactly after Dolly Parton, but I did like these specific things, so maybe that's what I will work towards. I don't know. Life is a balancing act. I'm still figuring it out. I absorb a lot of like self-help content. I enjoy listening to psychologists or therapists or cinema therapy. Like, I like those things. But sometimes I'll be watching videos from those people and I'm like, I don't know about this one, Chief. a little bit of a weird take on this thing. I'm not sure I agree here. You know, I can recognize, like, sometimes these people are helpful and they have good and helpful things to share. I may not always agree with them, and sometimes I can also recognize when maybe someone is not healthy for me to be absorbing content from. There are certain YouTubers who I really enjoyed, and then at a certain point I was like, they might be giving me some, like, really bad ideas about other people that I don't need in my brain today. Yeah, I don't know. Take everything with a grain of salt. Take all the things I say with a grain of salt. I'm just sharing thoughts that I had on my way to work. Maybe someone will watch this video and they'll be like, oh, these things are incorrect. That's not how any of that works. You don't know anything. You are a fool on the internet. That's what I was thinking about. And, I don't know. Are there, like, interesting rules or phrases that have kind of stuck in your brain? I think that's the most important thing for me, is that, like, certain thoughts or ideas or phrases about how to live your life or how to get along in the world stick in my brain a lot better than, like, books on the subject or even, like, really deep dives into therapy or whatever. There's just, like, certain little things, and I'm curious what those are for you. How do you judge other people? What do you think is the most important thing? Are what you say and do necessarily who you are? Is it something else? Is it your intentions? Because this is just, like, a definition I have created for myself about what is important to me, which is how people behave. You know, I think, like, the actions of people and the repeating pattern of those actions is what tells you who that person is. And I also think it's important to let people grow over time, because I know I wasn't a super great person all the time, and it's taken me a lot of work. It's taken me a lot of work and self-reflection to get to a point where I'm like, I almost like myself now. So yeah, that was my video. Those are my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed.
Consumed by the view of the last few rooms we zoom through. And darling, don't you look lovely?